Claudia Swan has held fellowships and grants from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study, and the NEH. Professor Swan is currently working on 2 books. One is A Brief History of the Imagination, and a second one is on the role of exotic goods and exoticism in the formation of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, and the topic on which she will speak to us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Claudia Swan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ronnie, for this very warm welcome and the warm welcome in general. I thank you and Jasmine Higgins, who extended the very generous invitation to me to speak here this evening. I'm honored and I'm very grateful. I'm also very grateful to John Hawley for graciously indulging my many requests. And if John is here, he'll know how many they were. Basically, John procured images for me to use this evening of works that are in the exhibition, the extraordinary exhibition. And the more I incorporated, the more I wanted to incorporate. So I'm so happy to be here. And I'm so happy you are all here. I am especially happy to see many dear family and friends, both flesh and blood friends and the friends on exhibit in class distinctions. What an extraordinary exhibition. What with its stunning array of 17th century Dutch paintings. As the press has also proclaimed, especially this week, these paintings, or really their orchestration here, offer a new perspective on Dutch society of the Golden Age. The Northern Netherlands, at the time of the formation of the Dutch Republic, which is to say Holland in the Golden Age, is both historically gripping and pertinent to present-day society. The era portrayed in the exhibition coincides with the formation of the first nation-states. The Dutch Republic of the Netherlands was declared sovereign territory in 1648, concluding the 80 Years' War with Spain, and at times Portugal, for its independence from monarchical Catholic rule. It was also, the 17th century, an era of globalization, and particularly in the Netherlands, an era of extremes in the distribution of wealth akin to contemporary proportions. This was a golden age in several respects. The accumulation of unsurpassed wealth, maritime and trade supremacy, and the knowledge attendant on that, and a time of resplendent artistic production. And let me just say that I open with this little brief comments on the 17th century in Holland and a slide of, that is a recent slide, of an item from that time. What you just saw, what you've just been looking at, is the jawbone of a whale suspended from the ceiling of a room, a chamber in the town hall in Haarlem. And here is a painted plaque that was mounted at the same time that the jawbone was hung. The plaque was actually painted by the rather famous author and painter Karel van Mander. It commemorates the gift of that whale's jawbone to the city of Haarlem. It was gifted after Van Linschoten, the individual who gave it, survived a trip seeking out a northeast passage and returned to his hometown of Haarlem, or returned to give this to his hometown of Haarlem. But let me now go back to the 17th century, I'll return to this later, and just take you through a few images from the exhibition to bring to life some of the points that I made about that time. The wealth that was amassed at the time by force of trade and the power of the trades and their status is depicted here in this group portrait of members of the Goldsmiths Guild, for example. Then we have an image, for example, of Constantijn Huygens, who was secretary, poet, humanist, and secretary to the stadtholder, shown in this extraordinary double portrait with his attendant, who is taking a note from him. So conducting affairs, Huygens conducting affairs, and among the tools of both learning and cultivation, there's a lute on the table. Double portrait of the shipbuilder, Jan Rijksen and his wife, Griet Jans, this extraordinary portrait, which if you haven't seen it yet, or even if you have, be sure to take a very close look at it while you can, as it belongs to Queen Elizabeth, and it will not be on show in the foreseeable future again. So the trades, again, an instance of the trades, and this is the shipbuilding, which was extremely important trade in the construction of the fleets who conducted the trade on behalf of the Dutch Republic in the East and the West Indies. I do want to say, by the way, that a graduate student reminded me recently that Jan Rijksen was the shipbuilder who constructed a very famous ship, the Batavia. Many Dutch ships were actually called the Batavia after the Roman Batavians, but the Batavia that he constructed sank in 1628 off the coast of Australia. However, it was not considered his fault. It was the pilot's fault, and of course, weather and forces above that. And then, of course, the extraordinary Vermeer painting of the astronomer. So here we could say, the wealth of knowledge that was accumulated in this country. And of course, all of these are paintings that attest to the accumulation of that wealth in various ways. Now, if you have seen the exhibition or read portions of the catalog or both, you will be familiar with some of the key contours of the political and religious makeup of the Dutch Republic. Writing in the third quarter of the 17th century, the English ambassador William Temple offered this characterization of what the catalog rightly describes as, quote, the unusual decentralized political structure of the Dutch Republic, close quote. William Temple wrote, and I quote, the main ingredients that have gone into the composition of this state are the freedom of the cities, the sovereignty of the provinces, the agreements or constitutions of the Union, and the authority of the Prince of Orange. The Prince of Orange, first Prince Maurits, following the assassination of his father, William of Orange, or William the Silent, Willem de Zwijger, in 1584. So Willem de Zwijger was assassinated in 1584, and shortly after that, Prince Maurits ultimately became the stadtholder of the United Provinces, but province by province. And subsequently, Frederick Hendrik, Maurits's half-brother, who was stadtholder from 1625. The Prince of Orange was a hereditary title, or was a hereditary leader with the title of stadtholder or stadthouder. He shared his power with the provinces, who were represented in The Hague in the Estates General. The stadtholder's power extended to appointing municipal officials, and he was the commander-in-chief of both the army and the navy. At home in The Hague, the stadtholders nurtured a robust courtly culture. In the course of the transition from a skein of provinces under Spanish rule to the Dutch Republic, the small, watery Netherlands underwent enormous change whose economic impact is charted so effectively in the pictures here in the exhibition. One of the principal changes was, as I've said, the astonishing accumulation of wealth in the major cities and in Amsterdam in particular. In The Hague, courtly society certainly kept up with royal and princely patterns of consumption of other smaller courts in Europe at the time. Here I show you the king and queen, the so-called winter king and queen, or the king and queen of Bohemia, out for a ride, and they are followed by Frederick Hendrik and his wife Amalia van Solms. So a great example of courtly pastimes and the robustness of courtly culture under the stadtholder, this mildly paradoxical situation. Okay, so courtly society kept up with royal and princely patterns of consumption of other smaller courts in Europe at the time. Conspicuous consumption was an issue. Some went all in for it, and others decried it. I think I have here the Terborg image of very fancy situation going on here. One of the most alarming events of the early decades of the 17th century was the murder of Prince Maurits's jeweler in the stadtholder's private apartments. It took place in March of 1616. This broadsheet is one of several publications related to that very dramatic event. It seems to have made waves around the country, at least, in the form of prints that were circulated. And it was a dramatic event. Jan van Wely, who was a very famous jeweler with a wide clientele both inside and outside of Amsterdam. In fact, he was known by collectors of rare and curious and valuable things around Europe. He traveled regularly to Prince Maurits's court and to his private quarters to bring him jewels for Prince Maurits's mistress, who is not portrayed in one of the paintings in the exhibition. I'll leave that to you to figure out. It's a secret portrait. She's there, but she's hidden. And Jan van Mely showed up in March in 1616 and was murdered by two of the attendants at the court, presumably because they wanted his jewels, which are pictured. Let me see if I can do this. Pictured here, at least some of them. So here you see him at gunpoint. This is not a snapshot, obviously. It's a reconstruction of what happened. His body was actually dumped and not discovered until 6 weeks after he was murdered. Lo, the risks of hankering after worldly goods. While The Hague was, and I should say, after it was discovered that he had been murdered by these two fellows, they were executed. So these are little gallows. They look like toothpicks, cocktail toothpicks, but they're actually little gallows. And behind we see the discovery of the body of the jeweler. You can tell what fortified these men, these little demons whispering into their ears, encouraged them to go for the goods. Now, while The Hague was the location of this murder, and Maurits was a client of Van Mely's, the ill-fated jeweler had an extensive clientele, as I said, throughout the Netherlands, and was known, in fact, even more widely. As for the interest in worldly goods on the part of the stadtholder and thieving, murderous attendants alike, let's recall that it was during the Golden Age that still-life paintings of worldly goods and paintings that thematized our relationship to worldly goods emerged full on. So this is the so-called first vanitas still life painting, or vanitas painting, a painting that essentially preaches the futility of investing in worldly goods or holding on too tightly to worldly goods. It's a beautiful painting in the Metropolitan Museum. And here, suspended in this ghostly sphere above the skull, are the things and cares of the world. They're a little hard to make out, but there are a number of figures in that sphere, reminding us that they too are ephemeral. Now, I did not come here this evening to pass along the gritty lessons of memento mori pictures or the naughty politics of the emergent Dutch Republic, though I'll admit I find both pretty exciting, and court intrigue is, after all, intriguing. I came to talk to you about encounters with the exotic. So let me tell you a bit more about what I had in mind by way of a picture that at first, second, and possibly even third glance has no obvious relation to exotic goods, namely Pieter de Hoog's interior with women beside a linen cupboard. Here, two women and a child people a lavish interior. While lavish, it is also within reach, sort of like design within reach, questionably within reach. It is not decorated to the hilt. The walls are not, for example, covered in gilt leather, as some were, and it is open to the street or canal beyond. As for the wealth represented here, note the red and gray Swedish stone in the fashionable after mid-century in the main room and the black and white marble in the entryway. The wooden gilded moldings of the doors and windows, the paintings, they're nearly indiscernible, but a landscape and a portrait or a landscape and a man. The paintings in ebony and gilded frames, fancy frames. The sculpture, which is a replica of Benvenuto Cellini's Perseus with the head of Medusa above the door lintel. The earthenware tiles at the base of the staircase, the wanli Chinese porcelain bowls perched atop the elaborate oak cabinet that is inlaid with ebony, and the dress of the two ladies doing laundry. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't dress this way when I put away my linens. So here's a detail. We are witness here to a nearly sacrosanct ritual codified in manuals published at the time of washing and folding and storing prized possessions considered crucial to the operations of the home. This domestic ritual, the implements on full display, the basket and the mangled tray for carrying linen are posed beside the women, is emblematic of a well-run household and a well-run household was the microcosm of a thriving republic. Now, one more comment about de Hoog's linen cupboard and about such cupboards in general. This is a fascinating point that is raised in the catalog in an essay by the cultural historian Herman Rodenburg on elements of Dutch pictures that we cannot see no matter how hard we look. The title of Herman Rodenburg's essay is Smelling Rank and Status. Of de Hoog's cabinet and others like it, Rodenburg reminds us that, quote, when such cupboards were opened, costly fragrances came out. One could expect to find in the most affluent households sachets of linen or silk filled with musk and ambergris or with less costly lavender, close quote. Now, I remind you again that the title of my talk is Rarities of These Lands, Encounters with the Exotic in the Dutch Republic. In the wanli bowls and the ebony inlay of the cabinet, so the bowls are perched here above the cabinet, we find explicit reference to foreign or exotic goods incorporated in the Dutch household. The possibility that opening the cupboard would have unlocked or unleashed redolent smells such as musk or ambergris compounds the exoticism, perhaps. But we're not quite there yet. Indeed, part of my argument about the exoticism of Dutch culture in the 17th century is that, from the perspective of its artistic legacy, the exoticism of 17th century Dutch culture is not self-evident. By and large, early modern Dutch art continues to be celebrated and studied for the image of 17th century Dutch society and life that it offers. Dutch art tends, that is, to be understood as a hermetic reflection of Dutch society and life onto itself. This is what it looked like to open up a linen cupboard in the 17th century, and it was important to paint it so that you could show what it should look like to open up a linen cabinet in the 17th century, or to decorate a home, or to conduct an orderly life as a housewife. Now consider the vast quantities of pictures, prints, drawings, and paintings alike that celebrate the places and landscapes and individuals and belongings and seagoing vessels and customs, as well as costumes, of the young republic in formation. They don't seem that exotic. At the same time, it is an incontrovertible and important fact that Dutch trade acquired global dimensions in the 17th century, and that the Dutch were actively engaged in trade and sometimes colonization in the Baltic, the Americas, Africa, the Levant, South Asia, and the East Indies. The facts of global Dutch trade, the fact that Amsterdam superseded Antwerp in the southern Netherlands as the European hub of global trade, the fact that seagoing vessels enabled the trade, and that the goods celebrated in still life paintings were the fruits of that same trade, are often cited, primarily to account for the personal wealth that enabled so many Dutch individuals to invest in the pictures that became so legion and so emblematic of the time. I am interested in taking the recognition of the role of trade in foreign parts and in exotic goods one step further, and in exoticizing the conventional image of Dutch culture by accounting for the widespread role of exotica in the making of the Republic. And tonight I do so by way of a few brief episodes in the history of the exotic Dutch Republic. So there are 5 brief episodes. The first is all the commodities and all the curiosities one could wish for, or turbans in the marketplace. You can take your pick. By the time the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, was founded in 1602, and the West India Company, the WIC, in 1621, highly prized exotica from the East had traveled overland for centuries. Indeed, in many regards, the Dutch were Johnny-come-latelys, or Johnnies come lately, I guess, to global trade. When they did begin to secure trade routes formerly controlled by the Spanish and the Portuguese, it brought the Dutch to prominence as global merchants, and the capital of the Dutch Republic, Amsterdam, to prominence as European port of entry for copious, spectacular, and profitable new commodities. And pepper would be the most famous of those commodities, right? So black gold, pepper, and other spices from the East. From the early 17th century, Dutch and foreign authors alike celebrated Amsterdam as a hub of commerce in wonders and foreign or exotic goods. René Descartes, the French philosopher who lived in Amsterdam during the 3rd and 4th decades of the century, marveled at the copious goods exchanged in the city. He wrote to his friend, the essayist Jean-Louis Guez de Balzac, of the pleasure of seeing, quote, the ships coming into port here, bringing all the produce of the Indies and everything rare in Europe. What place, he asked, on earth could one choose where all the commodities and all the curiosities one could wish for were as easy to find as in this city? The opening in 1611 of the Amsterdam Exchange, modeled on London's Royal Exchange and on Antwerp's Bourse, fortified the city's role as a hub of trade connected to all parts of the globe, principally by water. The Bourse itself, designed by the city architect Hendrik de Keyser, was situated on the dam for which the city is named, Amsterdam. It is the dam on the Amstel River, with direct access to the water, as you can see in this image, by which so many goods were conveyed to it for sale and purchase. The earliest images of the exchange, prints that were published in order to celebrate its construction, show a bustling mass of men in the interior courtyard where trade was conducted. It was conducted, by the way, only 1 hour a day, between 11 and 12, and then presumably continued elsewhere, but you could only conduct exchange officially on the floor, on the piazza, the interior courtyard of the exchange, 1 hour a day. And they managed to do quite a lot. These images, such as this here, feature men in turbans and antari, the Middle Eastern silk robes, agents from the Middle East, mingling with the Dutch and other European-dressed merchants. And this is a consistent feature of images of the exchange that also consistently goes overlooked. So this extraordinary painting in Rotterdam of the interior of the exchange is reproduced over and over again, and everybody talks about the man and holding a striking red mantle over his arm and pointing into this bustle, presumably the trading going on. But very few people talk about this constellation of figures in the foreground, these 3 men, 2 of whom are dressed in non-Dutch clothing. And the fellow in the foreground seems to me to be holding something shiny in his hand. So he might be a jewel merchant, I'm not sure. But they are certainly engaged in some kind of commerce, or at least conversation, but it seems interested commerce. And as I said, this is a consistent feature. It shows up even in this painting by Jules Bergheide, which is in the exhibition. Lo and behold, the only fellows wearing colored clothing, they actually do stand out once you notice them, are clearly foreigners from the Levant. By way of practices that were institutionalized by the VOC and the WIC in the East Indies and in the West Indies, and at and around the Amsterdam Exchange through merchants such as these or intermediaries for merchants from the Levant, because I'm not sure whether this is actually a fictional feature or whether there really were merchants active, but they do represent trade in goods from the countries these men embody, let's say. So by way of these practices, 17th century Holland actually abounded in exotic goods, foreign goods. Indeed, we know from a variety of sources that such exotic goods, and now I'm getting to what they might be, as Persian or Turkish clothing, textiles, so silks, and also carpets, of course, arms, which were avidly, so weapons, foreign weapons, which were avidly collected. They weren't used, as far as I know. Brazilian feather work, stuffed birds of paradise, that is to say, the ornithological specimens of plumage, lacquerware, Chinese, Japanese, possibly Korean lacquerware, products carved of ivory, lustrous shells, tulips, porcelain, bezoar stones, coconuts, and other compelling rare and costly items from the East Indies, Central Asia and the Levant, and the New World, the Americas, were on hand and available to the highest bidder, but there were plenty of those. So I show you just a few examples of quite extraordinary instances of exotic goods. So what do I mean by exotic? I'll say more about that in a moment, but these would be good instances. So we have a shell not from the shores of the North Sea, that's certain. And in both of these cases, the shell has been mounted and worked by European craftsmen. So on the left, it's dated to 1605 and probably from an Utrecht goldsmith shop. And it has this elaborate gilt, so silver gilt encasing. And it gets even better in the inside. When you lift the lid, there's a little lizard in gilt silver that is crawling out of the top. So it's very playful, actually. And then on the right, it's incised and inked with the forms of other exotic goods, such as tulips. Coconut shell, again, in this elaborate worked setting. And then most, I would say, maybe not the carnations, but most of the fruits and the shells and the flowers, certainly the tulips, were exotic to exogenous to the Netherlands at the time and the porcelain, certainly. I want to point out very quickly that this tablecloth looks sort of dull, and in fact, it's wildly discolored. It's lost its color. It was a vibrant red, apparently. Whereas the green is preserved in this painting, the tablecloth has lost its vibrant red coloring. And here, this extraordinary ensemble of shells, porcelain, and tulips. Now, much of the discourse of encounters with foreign lands and peoples naturalizes the accumulation by the Dutch of the products and other goods obtainable in those exotic locales. This is nicely illustrated by a portrait of the city of Amsterdam rendered in a 1611 print. I know you can't see much of this. I'll give you some details in a moment. It's a print that combines a profile view of the city, that's the long image, the profile view, and its harbor with a lengthy explanatory text and individual woodcut vignettes. There are 4 of them, those images that are set in, and those are images of landmarks of the city, all having to do with trade. The text is a paean to a city still in formation that is characterized already, this is 1611, as a global trade hub. It is called the widely renowned capital of trade of the entire world, Amsterdam. And this city, Amsterdam, is described as a new Antwerp and compared even to ancient Athens as the sun and soul, S-U-N, of all of Europe. People from all parts of the world feel compelled, according to the text, and this is borne out in the image, to, quote, send or present in person their priceless wares to Amsterdam as if to a world-renowned empress, close quote. The presentation of gifts to the Maid of Amsterdam, pictured above the text, embodies this dynamic. The personification of the global entrepot or global trade hub, so the personification of Amsterdam, sits on top of a throne of poles. These are the piles on which the city is built in the morass it occupies, right? So piles have to be driven into that swampland to build anything on top of it. And that's how she is configured, right? This is the allegory of Amsterdam, sitting literally on that soil on top of these piles. She holds a ship in one hand and the crest of the city in the other as she receives delegations of, they are called, all the principal peoples of the world. The text suggests where trade might be improved, and it revels in itemizing the fruits of where it is booming. The litany of goods from the East Indies includes, quote, the abundance of silk, precious gems, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cassia, nutmeg, and other spices, along with innumerable herbs and roots, that is sent from Java to Amsterdam is so great that one can hardly articulate it or describe it credibly, but they do. This verbal cornucopia extends to imports from Africa and Brazil, as well as Madeira and elsewhere in Spain and the Mediterranean and Turkey. Quote, silk, damask, velvets, kaffa, and other such artfully woven cloths, fine bombazine, glass drinking cups, Venetian mirrors, bezoars, etc., come here from Turkey, Italy, and other southern lands. That's a quotation from the text. The Tartar and the Persian with a laden camel, they're just off this detail, sorry. They bring gemstones, oriental pearls, the medicinal bezoar stone, many silks, balsam oil, and incense. And the list also includes tin and lead and other goods from England, Prussian items, milk and cheese and eggs from more local regions. So here, close to the personification of Amsterdam, these are the North Netherlandish fisherman and woman. The image is as replete with data, the text is as replete with data as the image it qualifies, where a wide variety of figures enact the trade described. In fact, Amsterdam is represented here as a city made of goods, very many of them exotic. No intermediaries or agents mediate the transfer of goods. Trade is represented here as a direct function of the desire of the various peoples and nations assembled to present their goods and wares. Look what we have for you. The Maid of Amsterdam sits among the various goods like an idol among remains of devotional rites. The text of the print concludes, and I quote, "In sum, everything that is necessary for the maintenance of the body and for the amusement of the spirit is here so abundant that you could say that God's merciful blessing, the very cornucopia or horn of plenty, is being poured down upon us." Now, of course, that's not how trade actually worked, but no wonder Descartes had so little trouble finding, quote, "all the commodities and all the curiosities one could wish for." 2. Outlandish without origin. In 1605, the widely renowned naturalist Carolus Clusius, then director of the Leiden University Garden, published 10 books on exotica, a compendious account of animals, plants, spices, and ethnographic items from the Indies, Africa, and the Americas. This is a study of things that are brought from foreign parts. Clusius uses the Latin terms exoticus and peregrinus, things that have traveled, to describe the sorts of goods that he compiles in this study. And both of the terms amount to a declaration of distant origin. In fact, in the period under discussion, the term exotic means nothing more and nothing less than foreign, just foreign, from somewhere else. And where the place of origin was designated, it tended to be as general as Indian or Chinese. These are huge categories that are used all the time, either of which could have meant the other. If you called something Indian, it could have been from China, or sometimes things were just called Turkish. As Anne Goldgar has shown in her wonderful study of tulip mania, and you see here that Clusius included tulips in the study of exotic goods. As Anne Goldgar has shown, the pursuit of strangeness or novelty or unknownness applied very generally. Lots of people were interested in just having strange things they didn't know about. They write about things, let's see, one person sends various things to Clusius, including a fruit or plant unknown to me, not knowing what it is, right? And this made it exciting to not know. Novelty, exoticism, foreignness, unfamiliarity, all of these things are associated, well, in fact, with all of these foreign goods that are coming in. And the tulip is actually a prime example. It was described as a strange and outlandish plant, foreign to us and a stranger, strangers unto us, outlandish flowers. As Goldgar points out, the strangeness of the tulip to early modern eyes is difficult to reconcile with their seemingly intrinsic Dutchness to ours. It sounds counterintuitive now that tulips are all but the national flower of the Netherlands, but it is not an exaggeration to say that one of the most central early modern Dutch exotic objects is the tulip, a humble bulb from Central Asia that actually only made it to Europe in the 1560s. There are other instances in Clusius's account of exotic goods, including this wild object. It doesn't survive, but he describes it as a Seychelles nut, so a very large nut. And it, like some of the objects that I showed you photographs of, it has been set in silver. He describes this as an object that was taken by the English in 1592, presumably from a Portuguese ship. I'm not quite sure, but objects like this were circulating back and forth. In fact, one was given as a diplomatic gift to Prince Maurits in 1601. Now, let me hurry up and get to some smelly stuff. Peppercorns in the closet. There is perhaps no more quintessentially representative figure of early 17th century Dutch politics than Johan van Oldenbarneveld, lawyer and statesman who fought on behalf of William the Silent, the father of the fatherland, and who then served as right-hand man to the stadtholder Maurits, until in 1619 van Oldenbarneveld was tried for treason and publicly executed. A show trial and a politically motivated turn on the part of the stadtholder that also secured van Oldenbarneveld's place as a martyr hero of the Dutch Republic. And I should say that one of the points on which Maurits and van Oldenbarneveld disagreed was on trade. It was a very hot topic, and whether the war with Spain should be continued, whether it fostered trade or actually prevented vibrant trade. until his death, his violent death by decapitation in the Binnenhof in The Hague in 1619, van Oldenbarneveld lived very well in a massive home in the heart of The Hague. So this massive home, which is actually where the King and Queen of Bohemia lived after it conveniently became empty when he was decapitated. I mean, that's ridiculously reductive, but it is true that they lived there afterwards. Now, shortly after he was executed, a household inventory was drawn up recording the contents of his grand home. This is not surprising because there's a wonderful image, a painting in the show of a notary, and it is thanks to these notaries and their really assiduous bureaucracy that we know what we do about the contents of Dutch homes, for example, about the interactions among people. And on the occasion of a death, and especially a death such as this where the property would have to be divided among his family members, notaries would come in and make inventories of the rooms. So it's terrible for Rembrandt that he declared bankruptcy in 1656, but it's wonderful for us because it means that his house was, that an inventory, a notarized inventory was conducted of his house room by room of all of the objects in it. The same thing happened after van Oldenbarneveld's death. That is not so surprising. What is surprising, however, are the contents. So while van Oldenbarneveld did own a number of things like paintings in ebony frames that look like the sorts of objects we might expect to find given our impression from a painting such as the De Hoog painting of the linen cabinet, he also owned an astonishing number of things that were described as Indian, which, as I said, could mean really anything. It could be Chinese, it could be Indian from the East Indies. He owned stones, he owned cloths. I think he slept on a bed that was covered by a canopy of Indian silk. Could be wrong. And I just brought this, or I used this illustration. Here's a sort of tent-like structure, a canopy that would have contained a bed. So this is a regular feature of homes, not always, and this is not Indian silk as far as I can tell, but we do know that he owned a bed with Indian hangings and a mantelpiece cloth made of the same, for example, and then a large Indian spread, the cap of a tent made of Indian cloth, for example, these. And in the linen cabinet, which was a separate cabinet that was itemized as well with all of his napkins and so forth, we find reference to een zakje met peper, a little sack of pepper. So this is rather interesting. I don't think because of the smell. I think he was given pepper regularly and that it was very precious and it was put in a place of pride. So a sack of paper. The variety of exotic goods around the home and the likelihood that van Oldenbarneveld slept on a bed hung with Indian silks significantly alter the conventional staid image of a luxurious Dutch home in 1619. So we have to remember that we're looking at them often through the lens of paintings, and paintings are, of course, paintings, depictions, compositions, creations. The evidence of domestic interior paintings falls short of rendering the exoticism of Dutch culture. The pepper tucked away in van Oldenbarneveld's good is just one instance among many. According to an appendix of the inventory that describes the contents of his prison lodgings, where he waited out his sentence prior to his death by execution, the great statesman ate there from Chinese porcelain dishes. Now, downstairs in van Oldenbarneveld's home, there are a number of paintings that are listed, including a painting of a Turk. And this is a description that we come across quite often, and we may never know, of course, what painting of what Turk van Oldenbarneveld owned, but the same sort of description comes up in Peter Paul Rubens's house inventory, and a few years after the death of Johannes Vermeer, when an inventory was drawn up of the contents of his family's house in Delft, it recorded not one, but 2 Turkish heads painted. We may never know who these heads were, what these paintings were, who these heads were, but I have grown to wonder whether the original title of this painting, The Girl with the Turban, I mean, this was not original, but at one point it was called The Girl with the Turban, might be more accurate than The Girl with the Pearl earring in the sense that she is wearing a turban, and she could, in the 17th century, have been taken, therefore, to have been, or this could have been taken to have been a head of a Turk. Another painting of a turbaned individual. Okay. I'm going to run through this very quickly and explain that in this section I merely wanted to justify my use of the term rarities of these lands, which may not sound peculiar to you, but I find it quite interestingly peculiar. It is a description. In 1612, the Dutch States General committed to making a huge diplomatic gift to Sultan Ahmed, the Ottoman Sultan. This in itself is an extraordinary instance of the Dutch interaction with exotic cultures. And what you see on the left is the Tugra of Sultan Ahmed, in which he offers to the Dutch state entry into Ottoman ports. And on the right, the sort of corresponding document in the Dutch archive is a list of the goods and presents that were sent by ship to Constantinople in 1612. They arrived in 1613. And the list is extraordinary and amazing, and I can talk about it more later, but it includes lots of Dutch things, furniture, cloth, 3,138 pounds of Edam cheese. I'm not kidding, I'm not making it up. But it also included a huge number of non-Dutch items. For me, so up to just shy of 900 pieces of porcelain, which, however much we associate 17th century Dutch taste with an interest in porcelain, was not a Dutch product, nor did the Dutch think it was a Dutch product. Porcelain, shells, and 8 dried or stuffed birds of paradise. And this really got me thinking about the Dutch engagement in exotic goods. What were they doing? Not only collecting, owning exotic goods, but giving them, and then giving them to the source of exotic goods, right? They were collecting Turkish and Levantine clothing or Ottoman clothing at the same time that they were giving goods from another exotic locale to the Sultan. Very interesting. And I don't know what scholarly, I went on full tilt when I came across this document. So hello and join me in the archives here. This document that specifies that money will be set aside to purchase rarities of these lands to give to the Sultan. Right, so they are, what are they going to give to him? They decide rarities of these lands. And, what does this describe? I mean, rarities should come from elsewhere, right? If they're rare, especially the way that many of them are described. So, especially these birds of paradise. So this is a German drawing of the plumage of birds of paradise that were considered extremely beautiful and very precious. The legs were more often than not hacked off because they were not considered beautiful or precious. Rembrandt owned dried, stuffed, dead birds of paradise. No live birds of paradise came to Europe in the 17th or 18th or even 19th century. So these were all dried, stuffed birds of paradise. And one thing that interested me about this is that here we are in the archive again. This is a receipt where the agents who are buying rarities of these lands, buy porcelain, so a bit long list of pieces of porcelain with their prices, and buy 6 birds of paradise, and then right down below, this is the blue arrow at the left, right down below 2 more, as if they said, oh, let's throw in 2 more of those. Now, as we know from this inventory, or from this receipt, that 3 birds of paradise cost, oh, right, so what happens is they go to Constantinople and then they're described as they're valued there in one of the historical accounts as $2,000, which is just a huge amount, which the Sultan regarded with amazement, these birds. Now, as we know from this receipt that 3 such birds actually cost just under 100 guilders, the Sultan's amazement seems to have increased the value exponentially to 35 times the current market value. And I think it's worth noting that the arc of the projection follows the pattern of actual profits rendered in these very years in Amsterdam on such goods as pepper and cloves. Anyway, that's okay. Beginnings and endings, coming full circle. A legend has grown up around the man portrayed here, who is known to be Wollebrand Gelijns de Jong. This fabulous portrait, painted by Cesar van Everdingen in the last year of Gelijns' life, 1674, hangs in the Stedelijk Museum in Alkmaar, the city that both painter and portrayed called home. For many years, however, Gelijnsen lived abroad. In 1613, he was assistant purchaser at Fort Nassau in Banda in the East Indies, the stronghold of the VOC. He returned from the East Indies to the Netherlands in 1622. And then following a decade back in the East, climbing the ladder of the company rung by rung, he was appointed Director of Trade in Persia and extraordinaris governor of India. So it was a very, very high rank in the VOC and posted to Persia. Notwithstanding some measure of trouble he got into with the Shah for buying silk outside of court channels, he was apparently flogged by the Shah himself. He returned a very wealthy man to Alkmaar in 1648. On the return fleet, which is pictured in the background of his portrait, he captained the ship called the Walvis. The Whale. Now here, in van Everdingen's complex portrait, Gelijnsen is powerful in many regards. He is obviously wealthy. His clothes, from the astonishing brocade to the rosettes on his shoes and his knees, in combination with his pose, are in keeping with sartorial, market, and pictorial trends set a half-century earlier by Frans Hals, for example. Oh, sorry, this is the fleet, and this would be Frans Hals setting some of those trends. Like Willem van Heithuizen, fabric merchant in Haarlem, whom Hals depicted showing off a splendid brocade suit and a gorgeous piece of fabric behind him, Gelijnsen too displays the wares on which he made his career and his wealth, from the silk brocade he wears and the mantle draped over a chair, to the ebony and mother-of-pearl rod that he holds, and the parasol held aloft to the African servant holding it, not to mention the trappings of worldly knowledge, the globe and the books and the instruments of measurement on the table, which itself bears a Persian carpet, and of course, the gold medallion that he proudly wears on a gold chain, and the garters too. Garters are, I guess, they're knee rosettes. I've been corrected. Now, these are not the clothes in which he sailed, presumably, nor is a parasol appropriate to weather in North Holland. All of these are trappings of the enormous wealth and power attainable in the Golden Age, precisely by way of trade in exotic or foreign goods. And we know that Woulebarend Gelijns de Jong was supplied, because he came back to the Netherlands and went back again to the East and then went to Persia. We have records of people giving him rather desperate shopping lists of things that they wanted to be brought back, all of them these exotic, curious, rare things. Let me just see, I have a few details. I just think this is an extraordinary gesture. And here the gold medal, which we know it was given to him in 1648. I'm cheating here because I've used the label from the Alkmaar Museum, but it's an honorary medal that was given to him that was actually made by a very famous Amsterdam goldsmith, whom we might know from a portrait by Rembrandt and etching, but I've brought you here because I think it's an interesting depiction of a man with the tools of his trade from this painting in the Rijksmuseum collection, so Jan Lutma or Johannes Lutma. Here is the ebony and mother-of-pearl inlaid rod that he's holding, which looks to me, like the rod or staff that many governors general of the VOC hold in portraits, but also like a civic militia guild provost rod in Alkmaar. Here, whether or not it's the civic militia guild provost rod that he's holding, the fact that this rod survives also indicates how ingrained the exotic materials of ebony and mother-of-pearl, for example, would have been in municipal life in the Netherlands, right? To think that this was the staff of honor that the provost of the Civic Militia Guild used. Let me see. Okay. Given what we learned from the exhibition, Class Distinctions, about the relationship between classes in the Golden Age, it should not come as a surprise to learn that Gelijnsen, or this fellow, served as regent of the orphanage in Alkmaar in the final decades of his life. Indeed, he left his worldly goods, including this portrait, to the orphanage. What may come as a surprise is that he himself was an orphan. Gelijnsen was not actually raised in an orphanage, but orphaned before he reached adulthood, and he was in the care of the municipality, he and his two brothers. So this is a rags to riches story, we might say, and notably one that is preserved in paint. I think this is really an extraordinary thing about the Dutch 17th century, that these stories are preserved in paint. Let me just see. Can't see what's coming. Oh, right, rags to riches. That was good, right? The story of the Golden Age is its own sort of rags to riches story. From a fishing village on the shores of the North Sea, Amsterdam and its citizens were catapulted to astonishing wealth, wealth derived from trade. That trade, conducted for the most part abroad, fueled the domestic trades. Together, ships' captains, jurists, and politicians, and merchants rose to a standing unparalleled even by modern-day standards. If we factor into the ascendancy of Dutch culture, both the astonishing cultural production, painting, and the visual arts above all, for who here can name many 17th century Dutch writers, and the horrors of war and slavery, then indeed this was an age like no other. In my view, the new nation-state took shape because of its encounters with the exotic, from Chinese porcelain and ebony here in De Hoog's interior to the astonishing collection of foreign or exotic goods amassed by Frederik Hendrik and Amalia van Solms at Huis ten Bos. Amalia van Solms put together an extraordinary collection of exotica, also described as Indian and East Indian, mother-of-pearl objects, coconuts, ivory, tortoise shell. Declaring themselves, and these were all housed in this, which is a wonderful example of Dutch classicist architecture. You would never guess that it contained this extraordinary collection of exotic goods. Declaring themselves merchants who lived like princes, the Dutch in the 17th century assumed the mantle of royal, Spanish and Portuguese, wealth, precisely by overtaking the trade in foreign goods, pepper first and foremost, but not by any stretch only spices. Now, we tend to characterize the Dutch nation by emphasizing its indigenous culture, clogs of wood for the swampy terrain, cheese made from the milk of cows who feed on its lush green grass, windmills for irrigation and for milling grains. The irrigated land is for grazing and therefore feeds the production of dairy. The grains milled are well suited for pancakes. But woven into the very Dutchness is a complicated history of exotic goods. Tulips are a great example of this, exotic goods made indigenous. We taste Dutch investment in exotic goods in the spices, the cloves laid into the cheese, or the speculaas at Christmas time. And even still, marriages are officiated in the shadow of this exotic mobile. Were it not so, I wouldn't be here, for this is where my Dutch mother married my father some time ago. From spices and whale bones and silks to shells and tulips to birds of paradise, the exotic, the foreign, fueled Dutch culture in ways not always evident or immediately visible, but fundamental or paradoxical in the sense of being rarities of these lands, local exotica. So the girl with the turban, the man with the pearl, a Dutch man wearing a turban and a pearl. Not immediately visible, but fundamental, and all the more so to contemporary Dutch culture. So this is an advertisement for the reopened Rijksmuseum that uses Rembrandt's man with the turban and the pearl. And this was one of many faces from the Rijksmuseum posted on billboards around the city when the museum reopened after 10 years. And the faces bear the logo of the Rijksmuseum and in various languages the word welcome. And this is an image I took at the tram stop right outside of the Rijksmuseum of the man with the turban speaking Arabic, saying, welcome to this particular population. So thank you very much for joining me this evening to explore some of the ways in which the Dutch in the Golden Age cultivated a market and a taste for rarities of these lands.
We have time for a few questions. There's a microphone here. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
I found it extremely interesting. All kinds of questions I'd like to ask you. I'll limit it to 3.
Okay.
First is, what were the Dutch produced items that they used in trade? Secondly, when they opened the doors of that cabinet and had all the spices inside, were they inside there partly because the house was going to stink, And the third is, what's the history and the rationale for that ridiculous collar that they wore?
Okay, number one, what did the Dutch produce? Well, going, for example, I mean, an example that I talked about is the gift to Sultan Ahmed in 1612, 1613. The Dutch sent, I have to say this very carefully for my students, a shipload of gifts that set out from Enkhuizen, filled really to the gills, if a ship can be filled to the gills. And it contained furniture, some of which was made from, I mean, none of the wood was actually native Dutch wood. It was coming from the Baltic, or it was exotic woods, whether it was ebony or from elsewhere. So they, furniture and textiles. There was an enormous, very, very successful textile industry. Wool, but the English were better at wool than the Dutch. And I think there was a sort of division of labor among the nations, or, you know, that's the way the market, or the market segregated them out. Let me just think, so certainly the textiles, furniture, they sent a number of printed books and maps, and they even sent printed editions of Calvin. I don't know what they thought the Sultan was going to do with the Calvin. That gift is actually extraordinarily remarkable for something that really doesn't survive. Nothing like it survives that I know of. Hendrik de Keyser, the city architect of Amsterdam, was enlisted and was paid very handsomely to design a candelabra, or a kroonmuchter, a candelabra for the Blue Mosque, which was under construction at the time. And the Dutch had been told that the Sultan was building a new mosque, and he designed, it was apparently made in wood, carved in the antique manner. There was brass, and there were Muscovy glass candle holders, and then the candles. And this was the largest of all of the items that was sent. But it's an extraordinary instance of a Dutch product, but produced for a mosque. The third question was about the collars, and I... Second question was the spices necessary to the house. Oh, right. Well, you know, they did a lot of washing. So, I mean, they did the washing of the sheets. Certainly it was. I think, I'm not sure that was the only reason. I think it was just as spicing in recipes is not only because the meat might not be fresh, but also for the flavor or for the scent. I know that there are receipts for anatomical dissections that specify how much, and it was quite a lot, was paid for lavender, because you certainly wanted to have lavender at an anatomical dissection. But that's a bit different from the linen cabinet, at least I'm hoping. The collars, I don't know that much about the collars, but I do know something that I shared with Ronnie Baer today, and this is not me, this is a costume historian and an archivist whose work shows that collars in the 17th century were something like ties to us. So not only did they change with time, that is to say the fashion changed over time, but individual men had individual tastes in collars. So you might choose to wear a bow tie all the time, or you might not. You might choose to wear a skinny tie or a fat tie. And likewise, 17th century men in their portraits tend to wear the kind of collars that they chose to wear. And household inventories show that a man might have owned 4 or 5 collars, but they would have been the same type. So the millstone collar or the less frilly collar or would have been different taste.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
My question is, you sort of implied that the Ottomans would have actually known about goods from further east because they were closer in a way, but I mean, the Dutch effectively either had a monopoly or controlled channels of distribution for things from, say, Melanesia, like birds of paradise, so they still would have been very exotic, wouldn't they, to the Ottomans?
Well, it's a great question, and it's the question I began with, that is, but wait, the Dutch were the masters of the trade universe. In fact, they really were Johnnies come lately, and they were following on the heels of Portugal and Spain. And one of the motivations, not the sole motivation, but one of the motivations for the revolt against the King of Spain was because the Dutch nobles, the northern Netherlandish nobles, wanted to trade outside of that monopoly. So whereas the Spanish and Portuguese, and they were linked for 40 important years, the Dutch wanted to trade independently. But when they started to trade in the East Indies, they actually found it rather difficult to get a foothold, and up to, just for example, so they gave in to, the tactics of war, basically, because they were fighting war with the Spanish and the Portuguese until 1648, with the exception of the truce for 12 years. They gave in to piracy, as many nations did. And it turns out that up to 500,000 pieces of porcelain, the first 500,000 pieces of porcelain that came into the Netherlands in the early 17th century were looted from the Portuguese. And everybody knew it. Everybody knew it. And so it wasn't anymore theirs in the early years. Later, they certainly did develop a greater stronghold. And so I think we work with the impression of those later years. But in these early years, they're still trying to gain a foothold and establish themselves. And then as for the Ottomans and their trading further east, the Ottomans had been receiving unbelievable, sort of mind-blowing gifts from the Safavids, for example. The Dutch were just presenting, relatively speaking, just a couple of things. So they didn't have that much to teach the Ottomans about splendor.
Hi, I first want to comment on your excellent pronunciation of Dutch words, Dutch language.
Dank u wel.
I have no questions, but may I make a couple of comments?
Yeah.
There was a question about what did the Dutch have to, in turn, to trade for all the trade that they had. Well, as far as the spices is concerned, they came with nothing. They simply enslaved the locals, especially in the Moluccas, where most of the spices came from, in an extremely brutal way, and just took the spices that they forced these people to grow. As far as the matter of the reluctance to display one's wealth in part of the population, that came from the Calvinistic church, whereas the Germans followed the teachings of Luther, the Dutch followed the teachings of Calvin, John Calvin, and he forbade any display of wealth and so on. And that's why you see so many of the portraits where the men are wearing black clothes, because those were then adherents to the Calvinistic church. Thank you.
Yeah. I just want to make one very brief comment about trade and war and the Dutch and brutality in early modern trade, which was very widespread, was that at a certain point, I mentioned a scholar named Anne Goldgar who's worked on tulip mania, this phenomenon, and her book really is the only historically sound account of tulip mania, which is otherwise has taken on legendary proportions. But one of the things that she points out is that many of the merchants who were trading in tulips were Mennonites. And there are moments in the early decades of the 17th century when Mennonite merchants are actively and openly opposed to the kind of the conduct of the Dutch merchants in the East Indies. And they declare that they are going to found a peaceful trading company to compete fundamentally with the Dutch East India Company, which is sort of an astonishing thing. Nothing ever came of that in terms of a peaceful or pacifist trading company, but I wonder whether they turned to the tulip trade as a more peaceful way of earning money, which they certainly did.
Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you all for coming.